My guest at this time is Mark Krikorian. He's the executive director at the Center for Immigration Studies. We've asked him to comment on Tuesday's oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court over President Trump's efforts to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, more commonly known as DACA. It was instituted by an executive order from President Obama back in 2012 and granted legal status to people brought to the United States illegally when they were still children. So what can we glean from the oral arguments from Tuesday, and how could it impact the larger immigration debate? We'll also discuss how the 2020 campaign is influencing the debate. And Mark, thanks very much for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, based on what I've read today from reporters covering the oral arguments, and it's always dangerous to try and guess what the decision is based on oral arguments, but overall they seem to think that it's looking good for the president's position here, that even though it could create a bit of hardship for quite a few folks who are in the DACA program, about 700,000 of them, that ultimately the president's reasoning here seems fairly strong. What was your reading of the arguments today?
Well, I mean, I think you're basically right that the Supreme Court is likely to uphold the president's authority to revoke this program because the one swing vote, Justice Roberts actually said that he considered the program illegal to begin with. But the important point to note here is that this case is not about whether DACA is a good idea or not, or whether it will cause people hardship to have their work permits not be renewed, that sort of thing. This is purely about whether a president has the authority to end a program that a previous president made up. Not even with a law, not with an executive order, not even with a formal regulation, the way government bureaucracies make regulations. This was just a memo. This was a memo within Homeland Security that made up this program. And the idea that a following president can't just issue a different memo canceling that one is ludicrous. I mean, there's no way the Supreme Court is not going to find for the president. What the president and Congress do after that, in other words, whether they come up with some kind of legislative deal or what have you, that's yet to be seen. But that's where the debate is supposed to take place. This case should not even have reached the Supreme Court. It should have been laughed out of court at the lowest level, at the district court level. The idea that it's gotten this far really is a testament to how broken our political system is.
And possibly the judicial system, because the lower courts have largely sided with the folks challenging the president's decision here. Mark, you and I have talked many times about policy and what reform ultimately ought to look like. And you have said that keeping DACA might be a good piece of leverage for this president or a future president in order to get some of the tougher mechanisms that you would like to see, such as ending chain migration and more border security and other more internal enforcement. If, in fact, the court strikes it down, does that give even greater leverage to use DACA as a way to get those things done?
Yeah, I think potentially. And the way to think about it is not, will the president trade DACA for something he wants? In other words, like horse trading. That happens in Congress, and that's a legitimate way of doing business. But here, what actually is necessary is if you think it's a prudent idea to legalize these young people who, came here for the most part not of their own choosing and grew up here. And I think it's probably a good idea. You need measures to limit the fallout from that kind of amnesty. It's an amnesty. Let's not kid ourselves. It's a smaller one relatively, but it's still an amnesty. But like all amnesties, one, it will attract more illegal immigration. Therefore, you need to have some enforcement measures in this kind of package to limit that part of the fallout. And what it means is extra legal immigration, basically. And so you need to offset that by cutting other parts of legal immigration. So my point here is not to get into the weeds. It's that when there's a deal discussed on this, as there will be next year when the Supreme Court issues its ruling, it really probably won't be till June. The deal is not going to be, I'll give you X and you give me Y. The deal is let's legalize these young people, but balance that deal, balance that amnesty with measures to try to limit the damage that any kind of amnesty can cause.
We're talking with Mark Krikorian, Executive Director at the Center for Immigration Studies. And, Mark, we've seen efforts to do some form of immigration reform a couple of times. George W. Bush tried it in back-to-back years. We had the Gang of Eight back in 2013, passed the Senate, ultimately didn't go anywhere in the House. So do you think this can get done in a divided Congress, or are there a lot of people, some perhaps on both sides of this debate, who would rather have the issue than a solution?
Yeah, I don't think next year there's going to be a bill passed on this. I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but it just seems to me too contentious an issue. The problem with those earlier bills back in 2007 and 2013 was they tried to do everything all at once. They were gigantic bills, 1,000, 2,000 pages long. If you're going to do something on an issue that's contentious like this, just do a couple of little bites at a time, see if it works, and do a couple little bites more. That way, if the Democrats, welsh on their part of the deal, you haven't given away much. Or if something turns out not to, in other words, it turns out to be different from what you expected, again, you haven't risked all that much. And I'm afraid that's the only way we're going to make progress. But right now, I don't see the Democrats agreeing to anything, whether it's a big or a small thing, to anything that the president could actually sign or would be interested in signing, because, they basically hate Trump. I mean, they become deranged by Trump. The guy would probably have worked with them from the beginning of the administration if they had been more, willing to talk to him. But they've turned him into such a hate figure that they can't bring themselves to work with him in any way. So the short answer is no. I don't think there's going to be any legislation on this, and I think these DACA people, a lot of them are in their 30s at this point, so they're not kids anymore. I think a lot of them are going to see their work permits expire, because it's not that they're going to be deported. They probably won't unless they commit crimes, but their work permits will expire. That's what DACA is about, is work permits. And we'll see if the Democrats care enough about it to actually try to come up with a balanced deal that the president would be able to sign.
Well, it's certainly unlikely that in a re-election year the Democrats would not want to give the president any sort of piece of legislation he could claim as a win.
Sure.
There's also a growing chasm here between the right and the left on what immigration reform ought to look like. Julian Castro started to tack left, and now Bernie Sanders has done so. In fact, Sanders recently has put together a list of reforms, or changes anyway, that have a lot of people raising their eyebrows. He wants to ban immigration and customs enforcement. He wants to get rid of Customs and Border Patrol. He wants to end deportations, at least temporarily. He wants to decriminalize illegal immigration and make it just a civil violation. And in his first year, if he were to be elected, he would allow 50,000 climate migrants into the United States. So where do you see this debate going when we're seeing at least a couple of these candidates on the left tack really far left on this issue?
Yeah, and that's not just Bernie Sanders or even Julian Castro. This is a problem that you're seeing on the Democratic Party in general, that it has become truly radicalized on immigration. And I don't use that word lightly. It used to be the Democrats were clearly more liberal. They wanted, they were a little more easygoing on enforcement. They were okay with higher numbers of immigrants, but there was always a certain amount of overlap, and they weren't nuts for the most part, at least the elected officials, the guys in charge who were responsible. The fringy, nutty people were kind of out where they belong, on the fringe. Well, that fringe perspective on immigration, that immigration control of any kind is illegitimate, that borders are illegitimate, that's not fringe anymore in the Democratic Party. That is the basic mainstream position of Democratic elected officials. Democratic voters, not necessarily, but Democratic officials at this point are in effect for open borders. If you say that, they'll say, no, we're not for open borders. That's just a way to shut down debate. Well, no, it isn't. Because if you say you're not for open borders, but you oppose every kind of measure that would, in fact, enforce immigration laws, then you are for open borders. And that's what we're seeing basically from all the Democratic candidates. And don't take my word for it. Tulsi Gabbard, who's one of those candidates, who's actually pretty far to the left, is very liberal on immigration. Even she has critiqued her fellow candidates for the presidency for all being for, in effect, open borders. This is it's a real problem for our politics because there's increasingly no room for compromise because the Democrats are basically saying all immigration enforcement, the very idea of immigration enforcement is illegitimate. Well, how can you compromise with that? So, it's going to be interesting to see where this goes from here, because at some point we're going to have to pass some immigration laws, and I don't see the Democrats willing to play ball in any meaningful way.
Well, certainly, as you mentioned, in this campaign season and really over the past few years, the chasm has widened considerably. Mark, as always, thanks for your time and your insights. We greatly appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Mark Krikorian, Executive Director at the Center for Immigration Studies. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.